In 1987, the quiet town of Ena, Illinois, became the scene of one of the most shocking unsolved crimes in American history. The Dardeen family, Keith, Elaine, their young son, and a newborn baby, were brutally murdered in their own home. There was no robbery, no known enemies, no arrests. The case has remained unsolved for over 3 decades, leaving a community, a state, and a nation asking the same questions. Who did this? Why? And how could someone commit such an extreme act and leave no trace? This is the story of the Dardeen family murders. Keith Dardeen worked in local construction. He was a hard-working man, known to his neighbors as quiet and dependable. His wife Elaine stayed home to care for their young son and, at the time, their unborn child. Friends described Elaine as kind, nurturing, and devoted to her family. The Dardeens lived in a small mobile home on the outskirts of Ena. Their neighborhood was safe, quiet, and close-knit. People knew one another, and violent crime was almost unheard of. For the Dardeens, life was ordinary. They followed the routines of small-town America: work, family, school, chores, and community. Nothing in their lives suggested danger, yet the very ordinariness of their existence would make the events that followed all the more chilling. The town was unprepared for the horror that was about to unfold. November 18, 1987, began like any other day. Keith Dardeen left home in the morning for work. Hours passed. He never arrived. Concerned co-workers tried calling the family's home. No answer. Neighbors noticed unusual signs. Mail began to pile up. Porch lights stayed off during the day. Something was wrong. Eventually, the police were called to investigate. Initially, it was treated as a missing persons case, but what they would soon discover went far beyond anyone's expectations. The first clue that something terrible had happened came when Keith's body was found in a remote wheat field, just a short distance from the family home. Keith Dardeen had been shot multiple times. The manner of his death suggested precision, the work of someone who intended to kill. There was no robbery. No vehicle had been taken. No struggle had been observed at the location. Investigators quickly realized that the murder of Keith might not be an isolated incident. Given the nature of the crime, they feared for the safety of the rest of the family. The officers immediately proceeded to the Dardeen home. What they discovered inside would shock them to their core. Inside the Dardeen mobile home, investigators found Elaine Dardeen, her young son, and their newborn baby, all dead. The crime scene suggested a deliberate and methodical act. There was no forced entry, which indicated that the perpetrator may have been familiar with the family or had studied their home in advance. The murderer had acted with time and intent. This was not a spontaneous act of violence, nor was it a robbery gone wrong. The scale of the crime, an entire nuclear family wiped out, stunned investigators. It was immediately clear that this was a case that would haunt the community for decades to come. Investigators meticulously cataloged every detail. They documented the position of the bodies, examined the trajectory of the gunshots, and collected fingerprints and other evidence. Ballistics suggested a precise shooting, with multiple shots fired at close range. The footprints inside the home were limited and inconsistent, offering few clues about the perpetrator's movements. DNA testing in 1987 was rudimentary. At the time, investigators could not analyze genetic evidence with the sophistication available today. Even so, the physical evidence left behind painted a picture of a methodical killer, someone who was careful, patient, and potentially familiar with criminal activity. Police immediately launched a full-scale investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed neighbors, and compiled hundreds of tips. Neighbors reported hearing unusual noises in the hours before the murders. Some mentioned seeing a shadow near the property, but no one could describe the person clearly. Investigators developed sketches based on these vague sightings and conducted extensive questioning of potential suspects. Yet no confessions were made. No credible leads emerged. The case began to grow cold almost immediately, despite the urgency and attention it initially received. Even after the initial investigation, fundamental questions remained. Why target the Dardeen? There were no known enemies. Nothing was stolen. No motive was evident. Was the killer random or calculated? Was this someone familiar with the family, or a stranger who studied their routines? Investigators could not answer these questions. For decades, the community would remain haunted by the unanswered mystery. Friends, neighbors, and surviving relatives struggled to understand how such an act could occur in their quiet town. The Dardeen family murders shocked a community, confounded investigators, and left questions that have persisted for more than 30 years. Who committed this crime? Why were all 4 members of the family killed? And why has justice never been served? Part 2 will explore the investigation in greater detail, the various theories, and the chilling reality that this case remains unsolved to this day. In Part 1, we explored the shocking murders of the Dardeen family, Keith, Elaine, their young son, and their newborn. An entire family erased in their own home, leaving behind a trail of questions with no answers. Despite the early investigation, no arrests were made. No motive was ever discovered. Now, we delve into the investigation itself, the suspects, the theories, and why this case remains one of Illinois' most haunting unsolved crimes. Immediately after discovering the bodies, law enforcement launched a full-scale investigation. Officers documented the crime scene, collected ballistic evidence, and interviewed neighbors. The initial focus was to determine whether the murders were the work of a local resident, someone familiar with the family, or a stranger. Investigators created sketches based on vague witness descriptions and canvassed the surrounding area extensively. Despite their efforts, few solid leads emerged. Neighbors described seeing a shadow near the trailer, hearing unusual noises, or noticing vehicles they didn't recognize. Each tip was investigated, but most led nowhere. As days turned into weeks, frustration mounted. Investigators began to suspect that the perpetrator had planned the crime meticulously, leaving behind minimal evidence. From the very beginning, police considered several possible suspects. Family acquaintances were questioned, including neighbors, distant relatives, and co-workers of Keith Dardeen. Theories ranged from a random act of violence to a targeted attack. Some believed the killer was someone who knew the family well, capable of moving freely inside the home without forcing entry. Others suggested a psychopathic stranger who had selected the Dardeens at random. Psychologists analyzing the case later described the crime as indicative of a highly organized and deliberate offender, someone who could commit murder without leaving identifiable traces. Despite extensive investigations, no suspect was ever identified, and no one was brought to trial. While the murders shocked the local community, national media coverage was limited. Unlike other high-profile cases, the Dardeen family murders received little attention outside Illinois. Local newspapers reported on the tragedy, but without arrests or dramatic developments, the story quickly faded from public attention. For the residents of Ina, however, the impact was lasting. Families worried about safety. Neighbors became wary of strangers. Children were kept closer to home. The ordinary rhythm of the town had been permanently disrupted. The lack of media coverage only deepened the sense of isolation and mystery surrounding the case. The Dardeen story became a haunting reminder of how violence can infiltrate even the quietest communities. One of the greatest challenges investigators faced was the limited forensic technology of the late 1980s. DNA analysis was in its infancy, and techniques available today did not exist at the time. Fingerprints were collected, ballistic evidence documented, and physical evidence preserved, but none pointed conclusively to a suspect. Investigators later noted unusual aspects of the crime scene: the methodical nature of the killings, the lack of forced entry, minimal traces of the killer's presence inside the home. These factors suggested a perpetrator with careful planning and knowledge of criminal procedure, someone who knew how to commit murder without leaving identifiable evidence. Experts analyzing the Dardeen murders over the years have proposed several theories. Some believe it was the work of a family annihilator, a type of offender who targets entire households for unknown motives. Others suggest a psychopathic opportunist, taking advantage of a quiet rural setting. The meticulous nature of the crime indicates patience and premeditation. The killer did not panic. They knew exactly what they were doing and left the home in a controlled state. Despite decades of profiling and investigation, these theories remain speculative. There is no conclusive evidence to support any particular explanation. In the years since 1987, the case has been periodically reviewed by cold case units. Advances in DNA technology, ballistic analysis, and forensic psychology have been applied to the evidence. Investigators re-examined fingerprints and ballistic samples, hoping modern techniques could finally identify the perpetrator. However, after decades, no new leads have emerged. The lack of witnesses, limited evidence, and passage of time have made solving this crime increasingly difficult. Even with modern investigative tools, the Dardeen family murders remain a haunting, unsolved mystery. The murders left a lasting mark on Ina, Illinois. Families became cautious, wary of strangers, and reluctant to leave homes unattended. Friends and relatives of the Dardeens have lived with the unanswered questions for decades. The case has become a somber legend in the town, a reminder that extreme violence can strike anywhere, even in the safest of places. Despite efforts by investigators, law enforcement, and researchers, the truth behind the Dardeen family murders remains elusive. The Dardeen family did not simply disappear. They were intentionally and violently erased from the world. Who committed this crime? Why were they targeted? And why has justice never been served? These questions linger to this day. For the residents of Ina, for investigators, and for all of us, the Dardeen family murders remain a chilling reminder of a crime that defies explanation. The case is still officially unsolved. The killer remains at large, and the truth may never be known. Subscribe Criminal Verse, where every crime hides a story.